And her dissertation research looks at underground indie rock in Korea, right? She just got back from doing a year of field work in Seoul, and she was just telling me that she basically went to concerts and was nocturnal and partied every single weekend, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, every single weekend for a full year.
Don't tell my advisor.
Yeah. She's gonna be talking to us about K-pop, Korean rock, kind of the Hallyu wave. For those of you who have Korean American profiles today, we'll get to those at the end, and if we don't have time for that today, we'll move them over to Thursday. But I wanted to make sure that Kendra had plenty of time to talk to us today. So I'll turn the floor over to Kendra. Cool, thank you.
Yeah, thanks guys for having me. So today we're going to talk about K-pop, K-rock, and the Hallyu. So we're kind of going to start. I'm going to give you a basic overview of Korean popular music since the early 1900s, very quickly. And then we'll kind of go into more detail from 1990 to present, giving some background information about K-pop and its connections to the U.S. in some ways. So, cool. So, in the colonial period, as you guys know, Korea was colonized by Japan in around 1910. So popular music during this period was filtered through the Japanese colonial government. And in this period it's called Yuhenga Changa, or literally translates to popular song. And it's also called, kind of in retrospect, often called chut or pyeongjuk, which pyeongjuk is just kind of an onomatopoeia of like pyeongjuk, pyeongjuk, dun, dun, pyeongjuk, that kind of sound that the music tended to make. So it's kind of often used as a derogatory term, like we call it like boomchik music. That'd be the same thing in English. So the biggest issue kind of with this music was it was based on a Japanese form called enka, which is very similar. So this causes issues later in history, which we'll get to. But basically, if you're thinking about Yuhenga Changa, it's a mix of Western popular song and a traditional vocal style. So you're using kind of, especially during this time period in the West, jazz was what was the popular music of the day. So you kind of have jazz background or kind of symphonic background with Western scales, but then a traditional vocal sound or style to it. So this piece is Falling Flowers and Flowing Water by Kim Young-hwan. And it's going to sound a little bit scratchy because it's actually taken from a vinyl record from 1929, so keep that in mind when you're listening to it, but you can hear the vocal quality. Boom, chick, chick, boom, chick, chick. So you can see my thumb coming to the front top. That kind of forward vocal quality, a lot of vibrato and a very strong musculature of the throat in that vocal quality, which is very similar to a traditional musical style called pansori, which is a kind of sung storytelling genre. So we're going to move right on along to, not that far, 1945 to 1960. So after the colonial period, you have the American, we're going to move to South Korea now, we're just going to be talking about South Korea. The American occupation and the Korean War. So you've got a lot of direct interaction with the West. So instead of filtering this Western popular music through Japan, now it's coming straight from the Armed Forces Korea Network military radio. So this was kind of a big influence on a lot of musicians in Korea during this time period, because the government often tried to control where the American military members could go for entertainment and things like that. But you can't control radio waves. So people could hear the radio anywhere in Korea, and they could hear about Western music, hear pop music, and be influenced by it and try to play it. In terms of performing, the biggest employer of pop and rock musicians during this time period would have been the American military. There was it became an industry in and of itself, this group of, these troops of performing musicians who would play for military on the base or near the base, hired by the government, and then as the period goes on after the Korean War, you get people opening up clubs and performing usually near the American military bases, performing sometimes for American military, but it starts to slowly become more and more for a Korean audience. So here's a couple examples. This is a really famous group called the Kim Sisters, three sisters. All last name Kim, obviously. They actually became very famous in the US as well. They were on the Ed Sullivan Show. This is on an American show called the Hollywood Palace. And they were well known. They were kind of the well known for their doing military circuit performances and doing covers of American pop music. So.
From Korea, who rank among the most versatile entertainers in the business. They not only sing, but they play about 20 different instruments: saxophone, clarinet, violin, vibes, trumpet, drums, and several others. They would have played more, but you know how kids are. They hated the practice. Ladies and gentlemen, the Kim Sisters.
So they're kind of modeled after, I don't know if any of you know, the Andrews Sisters was another group of sisters who did this kind of close harmony music for military performances during a similar time period. So it's the same kind of system or the same kind of idea, just transplanted. And then as we go on a little bit, we also have the starts of rock music in Korea, or R&B, which would be the 50s and 60s, what it was called. And a lot of this stuff, it was very interesting. There's a similar movement called group sounds in Japan that had this kind of Beatles-esque sound to it, or early Beatles, Monkees kind of sound, and they called it group sound. But in Japan, it was very focused on singing in English. Like the assumption was that if you're going to do rock music, it has to be in English. But in Korea, when rock music was picked up in the 60s like this, it was actually picked up and tended to be in Korean and played more for Korean audiences than for military audiences. So this is an example of a group called Ad 4. Woman in the Rain. And you can even see the way that they style themselves as well. The short kind of bowl haircuts, high guitar, very similar to the rock music of the time period in the US, or actually in Britain in the case of that. Okay, so now we get into the 60s to the 80s, like kind of later 60s, and the military dictatorship. So I'm going to split this into pop and then rock. So with popular music, the government was especially in the late, as the kind of dictatorships got going, got more and more invested in censoring or controlling popular music, the messages of popular music and the sounds of popular music. So a lot of times the government actually would hire artists to create, and they would create government-sponsored music, like health music is what they called it, to help support, good ethics and good morals and things like that. And a lot of pop albums actually were required to have one of these like health music or government-sponsored music songs on any album that they produced in Korea. So especially, like I said, as things kept going, it got more and more cracked down. The biggest issue with, in terms of pop music, was talking about trot. So like I talked about earlier, that Yuhanga Changa kind of evolved into what we now call trot, which is kind of at its heyday in this time period. And it's the same kind of thing, popular music with a traditional vocal style, but now we're taking popular music of the 60s and 70s and early 80s, so more in terms of the popular style of that time period. And the issue became this a thing about sound and weisek, or foreign color. And weisek was specifically referring to Japanese foreign color. So there was a lot of issues, especially amongst academics in Korea at this time period, as to whether trot was actually Korean or if it was actually Japanese. Like if it was too close to Japanese enka to be considered actually Korean. And this kind of came to a head in the Bongjak debate of 1984. Someone published in one of the major newspapers a long diatribe arguing that trot was not Korean. And then there was feedback, and the next week someone posted things saying it was Korean, and there was just back and forth and back and forth. But because of this issue, especially with weisek, the government administrations really kind of cracked down on trot and controlling the sound of trot or the way people perform trot, banning certain pieces, trying to keep this under control. And what I find fascinating in my own research is that on the Japanese side of things, there's a similar debate, as if Japanese enka is too Korean, if there's too much Korean influence in Japanese enka. So it's kind of funny to me that both sides of this equation have anxieties about the nationality of this type of music. So I'll play a little bit of this stuff. This is from 1967 from a TV program. Let's see, what is it gonna... So we'll play a little bit so you can hear kind of what the 60s trot sounded like. If it'll play. Skip ahead a little bit so you can hear a male singer doing trot. And interestingly, in terms of dress, the women tend to wear traditional dress, men tend to wear suits doing trot. There you go, I'm gonna put that up. So what this woman is wearing is actually more common for women to wear when they're performing trot. Is a typical, like a hanbok kind of traditional dress. But men tend to wear suits. Sexism. So basically the biggest thing with trot was, in this period, was kind of smoothing out the voice a little bit. Having more weisek of Western color was okay, was better than sounding too Japanese. So a lot of the singers of this time period didn't have as much of that rough vocal quality that the traditional music has, but still had enough of that wobble vibrato kind of sound that it sounded Korean. So that was kind of how they got around the government issues with it. Okay, so rock music during this time period. So like I said, the government was kind of cracking down on popular music, and it was especially difficult on rock music. It saw rock music as kind of a symbol of like nightlife and unethical behavior and drinking and drugs and all of this. So a lot of clubs were closed or raided. If you performed, it a lot of times had to be underground. So it was really hard to get a scene started. A lot of other countries have these types, like from the 50s to present, where they've been constantly having rock music performed live in clubs and things like that. In Korea, because of this dip down, where they didn't have an opportunity to play, it meant that things had an uphill battle once the dictatorships were over. And it was not just in terms of music, but in terms of dress and culture as well. So like this is a picture of a policeman cutting someone's hair because it was too long. They would like measure people's hair if guys' hair was too long, or measure women's skirts if they were too short. So it was this kind of policing of ethics that they often associated rock music with a negative ethics and therefore kind of cracked down on it. And a lot of the musicians during this time, there was still a decent psychedelic scene during this time period, but it was very much kind of underground, like it was cafes that turned into clubs at night but don't tell anybody kind of situation. The other type of kind of rock music that was being performed was Tomkita, which is the music of protest. So it was kind of sounded like American folk music, like Bob Dylan, you know, that kind of era, and had this kind of undertones of protest against the government. And it was always this kind of dance of not being too overt with your anti-government message that you actually would get arrested or get, you know, in trouble for it, but, you know, kind of keeping it, making it clear to an audience that's in the know what you're talking about. So this is an example of one of the most famous Tomkita songs. Morning Du by Kim Min. But basically the morning dew is symbolic of the people who are suffering, and so uses it as a metaphor, but not an overt metaphor that the government could actually do something about. Okay, so we're already to the 1990s. Awesome. So, post-dictatorships in the late 80s, early 90s, you get this increase of youth culture and youth spending power because of this kind of change in how the country was functioning. The 1990s is also the rise of idol pop. And then we have the Korean wave and international emphasis on marketing, and then the resurgence of underground rock music making. So that's kind of the outline for the rest of the talk here. So we will start with the beginning of K-pop. This is kind of the mythic beginning. When people refer to the first K-pop song, this is what they usually refer to. It's called Nan Areo by Saltaeji and the Boys. It is very dated.
And why is that?
We'll get there in a second. Okay, so we'll stop there. So for those of you who are familiar with K-pop in any way, you can see a lot of kind of the tropes or things from current K-pop in this example. So this was one of the first songs of this type to really hit it big in Korea or be popular on mainstream channels. So up until this point, that b-boy dancing, the rap, this kind of stuff was all underground popular. Like people would see it on the street. It was part of the youth culture, but it hadn't hit a mainstream status, been on television and things like that until this song. And actually very interesting, Saltaeji was in a hair metal band, in the mid-'80s, and then switched over to doing this kind of rap and b-boy thing. So you can hear, especially if you listen to some later Salteji, you can hear a lot of that heavy rock influence in the way he does things. And even in this example, you hear the guitar riff in the middle there, which is not as typical of hip-hop of this time period. So the main reason people point to it as kind of this beginning of K-pop practice is, like I said, because of all of these different kind of tropes that came from this specific song. And it's probably not that they started these tropes or they originated these tropes, but because it was the first popular example, a lot of the things that came after tended to follow some of the things that they did. So one of the first thing is the single-sex group. So you have, it's 3 guys. That's still very typical of K-pop. You have a just guy group or a girl group. You don't tend to have mixed gender groups. But the biggest thing, the thing that most academics point to, is the importance of dance. So in this, you can see, dancing was a big part of what was happening. So the visual and the music and the dance all being matched together is a big part of it, or what they call the concept of the song. So in K-pop today, you still have that with different stages having specific concepts. So the stage is the kind of dance, visual, kind of amalgamation that you have with each different song. And K-pop groups tend to change their stage persona depending on their thing. And the reason we call it stage is because non-audio became popular by being on these music programs, these weekly music programs. So up until this point, the weekly music programs were mostly focused on ballad music. There's a lot of slower music, more emotional. But then non-audio came on the stage, and from this point, you really start seeing a lot more dance-oriented. So here's an example of them on television. So I'm going to stop it there. Oh, that's what I wanted to do. So, we'll get there. What I wanted to point out about this that's interesting is you can see the way the stage is made here. You've got, you can't see it very well actually. There's risers, 2 risers here and a circle and then a floor. And that's because these shows were meant for ballad singers. So you have a ballad singer standing on this stage singing their ballad. And so when they're coming on, they're having to change how they're using the stage. They're moving around in different places and trying different things because of the dancing oriented. And nowadays when you see music programs, it's always a flat stage, or typically a flat stage, unless there's props or different organization. But it's oriented to the dance, the specific dance stage that's happening, rather than to a single singer. And then the other thing that Salteji and the boys kind of made popular is taking time off and doing a comeback. So they had this first album and they promoted the songs from it. Then they took some time off and they called it a comeback. Then they came back. And that's still a term that is used in K-pop a lot. When a K-pop group goes away for a while or is promoting one album and then comes back with a new album. So when they have a comeback stage, their next stage. And then of course the synchronized dancing as well, like having this unison dancing and mixed dancing. The other thing in terms of music that they is a trope that's still used is the mixing of musical styles. So rap is still a very common thread within K-pop. You've almost always got some sort of rap group member, and you've got rap in it, so it's still very common. Sampling, internal and external, so sampling of Western popular music and sampling of Korean popular or traditional music as well. You could hear in the beginning of this one, East Coast and the Yeah Boy are both from rap musicians in the US, sampled and things like that. So it's using kind of because hip hop sampling is a very common thing. So it's kind of pulling from that typical practice. And then they're changing the music and the image often. So their next album had a very different sound to it. One of the major differences is the constructions of groups. So these guys were friends who were working, playing in underground and became popular. But after this point, in the mid-90s, you start to get groups being made. And you have these idol machine, is what we call it, So you have companies who will train singers and then bring them together, or have solo artists and promote them and all of that. So it's not so much pulling talent that's already playing from the underground, but cultivating young talent to do what you want them to do for your specific needs within this idol machine. So early K-pop, the 1990s. So the big three companies, talking about that idol groups, the big companies SM, YG, and JYP. 95, 96, and 97 specifically. And the big groups of this era were Hot, SES, Sex Geese, Baby Vox, GOD. There are a couple more, but basically most of these started really becoming popular in the kind of late 90s, like after this kind of machine really started revving up and getting going. So we're going to play a little bit of that so you can kind of hear and see what that was like. If it'll play, maybe. So you can still hear a lot of rap going on, but this is around the same period as like Destiny's Child, TLC, starting of the kind of boy and girl groups. So you see some of that influence kind of coming in during this time period, pulling from that. And I realized that you guys are younger than me, and so I had to point out that the ridiculous gold thing is actually not that weird if you look at American pop music at the same time. Like this shiny giant suit thing was apparently really cool. I don't get it. But yeah, so this kind of, these formulas of boy group and girl group, and the sound was very similar to, like I said, like a Destiny's Child, TLC, Will Smith, this kind of, hip hop oriented music. So, cool. So, branching out after the IMF crisis. Did you talk about the IMF crisis a little bit?
A little bit.
Okay. So basically it was a big kind of economic collapse in East Asia in 1997. And so a lot of different industries had, kind of crisis moments, and they had to try to figure out how to rebuild from this. And the K-pop market wasn't any different. So the realization they had was that you can't just market to Korea anymore. Like, the market in this country is too small. We can't survive if we have another crash like this. So they really started strategically focusing outward. The government definitely, the big part too, the government heavily supported culture, arts, especially after some of the dramas and stuff became popular in Japan and China. They saw that happen and realized we could actually, make this still keep happening. We can keep doing it. So the government threw a lot of money into culture industries like K-pop and dramas and things like that. So in terms of the idol machine, the strategies that they were really focusing on, especially kind of after the IMF crisis, were language and culture training for specific markets. So teaching artists specific languages that they were going to market them to. So the example, I think, from what you guys read was with Boa, like making sure she could speak Japanese and then trying to market her to a Japanese audience. And they still do this today. A lot of times, especially with the bigger groups, you'll have specific members who are kind of meant for specific markets. Like, this member can speak Japanese, so they are the spokesperson when we do Japanese interviews. This person can speak English, so they're the English, they kind of delegate these responsibilities in terms of language. And also culture, we'll get to that in a second. Okay, so culture as well. Transnational band members. So that's the other thing in terms of culture. They would bring in a lot of people that did not grow up in Korea, so Korean Americans, Korean Canadians, Zainichi with Koreans in Japan, or they would bring in even other people from other Asian backgrounds, so Taiwanese Americans. An example is not 21, FX. Amber from FX is Taiwanese American, and the kind of and bringing in people who are Taiwanese or Chinese. or I don't know if it's Japanese. Anyway, but bringing people from different countries into K-pop groups to try to help this diversification and help them market outside. They also started performing in different languages as well, or doing songs in both Korean and